The sound of tires crunching gravel filled the quiet evening air as Julian Coleman, a 48-year-old man with a calm demeanor and a reputation for leadership, turned onto Sycamore Avenue. He was coming home from a long but rewarding day spent meeting with community leaders in Charlotte, North Carolina. His car, a modest black sedan, blended into the suburban streets, and his thoughts wandered to his wife's famous pot roast waiting at home. But then, blue and red lights flashed in his rearview mirror, slicing through the night like an alarm bell. Julian's grip on the steering wheel tightened momentarily. He checked his speedometer, 29 and a 35. No traffic violations, no broken taillights. Yet the patrol car's siren wailed, signaling him to pull over. "Stay calm," he muttered to himself as he signaled and eased his car to the side of the road. He knew the drill. Hands visible, movement slow, polite demeanor. It was a routine he'd mastered, not because he'd ever done anything wrong, but because he'd learned that in these situations, appearances could mean everything. The officer approached his window briskly, flashlight in hand, its beams slicing through the dimly lit interior of Julian's car. Another officer lingered near the rear bumper, hand resting on his holstered weapon. "You in a hurry tonight?" the first officer barked, his tone dripping with suspicion. "No, sir," Julian responded evenly, his voice calm but firm. "Just heading home." The officer's flashlight swept over Julian's face, lingering just a second too long before darting down to his lap, his console, and then back to his face. "License and registration," he ordered, ignoring Julian's response. Julian reached slowly into his glove compartment, narrating every move. "I'm getting my registration now. My license is in my wallet. I'll reach for it after this." The officer didn't respond, but his posture stiffened. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, though the question felt rhetorical. Before Julian could respond, the officer continued, "You were driving erratically back there, swerving into the other lane." Julian frowned. "With respect, sir, I wasn't swerving. My dash cam can verify that." The officer cut him off sharply. "Dash cam? Huh? That'll be confiscated for evidence. Step out of the vehicle." Julian blinked, surprised by the sudden escalation. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I'm complying fully." The officer's jaw tightened. "I said, step out of the vehicle. Now." Julian's stomach churned, but he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door slowly, his hands raised in clear view. The second officer moved in quickly, grabbing Julian's arm and yanking him toward the patrol car. "Is this necessary?" Julian asked, his voice measured but firm. "I've done nothing wrong." "Resisting, huh?" the first officer sneered. "You want to play that game? Fine by me." The cold metal of handcuffs bit into Julian's wrists. His mind raced. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was profiling, plain and simple. As the officer shoved him into the back of the squad car, Julian glanced down the street. A few neighbors peeked through their blinds, their silhouettes illuminated by the glow of their porch lights. No one stepped outside. But this was far from over. The officers had no idea who they had just arrested, and Julian wasn't planning to stay silent for long. The patrol car rattled slightly as it rolled down the street, Julian sitting stiffly in the back seat. He glanced out the window, watching familiar landmarks blur past. But his mind wasn't on the scenery. Instead, he was trying to process the absurdity of what had happened. The two officers sat up front, exchanging casual banter as though they hadn't just handcuffed and detained a man without cause. The younger one, Officer Daniels, glanced back at Julian through the rearview mirror. "So, what's your story? Late-night drug run? Or are you just like giving us a hard time?" Julian met Daniels' gaze, unflinching. "I'm just a man trying to get home." "Yeah, sure," the other officer, a stocky man named Officer Reed, snorted. "We hear that all the time. Reckless drivers always have an excuse." Julian bit his tongue. Arguing now wouldn't help. He took a deep breath, mentally running through his options. He knew his rights. He also knew the system. and the odds that it would favor him in this moment were slim. When they arrived at the precinct, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare over the holding area. Daniels removed Julian's cuffs with an almost mocking flourish. "Welcome to our humble abode. You're gonna be here for a while." "Am I being charged?" Julian asked calmly, rubbing his wrists. Reed smirked. "We'll let you know once we figure that out. Sit tight." Julian was led into a small, cold holding cell. The door clanged shut behind him, the echo lingering in the air. He sat on the bench, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He'd spent years building a career rooted in justice and fairness, and now he was being subjected to the very abuse of power he'd worked to eradicate. Outside the cell, the two officers leaned against a desk, laughing quietly as they reviewed Julian's license and car registration. "Nothing out of the ordinary," Daniels said, sounding almost disappointed. "Doesn't matter," Reed replied with a smirk. "We'll find something. Guys like him always have skeletons in the closet." Julian overheard their exchange, his expression unreadable. He remained seated, hands clasped, posture steady. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. He knew his patience would pay off soon enough. Hours dragged by. Other officers came and went, casting curious glances at the man in the cell. None of them seemed to recognize him, but Julian didn't expect them to. He was new to the area, having taken the position only 3 weeks prior. Finally, just as dawn began to streak the sky with faint orange hues, Julian heard footsteps approaching. A stern-looking officer, clearly higher-ranking, appeared in front of the cell. Her badge read, Lieutenant Morgan. She carried an air of authority and professionalism that immediately contrasted with the other two officers. She frowned as she glanced at Julian, then back at the paperwork in her hand. "What's going on here?" Daniels stepped forward. "Picked him up last night for reckless driving and resisting arrest." Morgan arched an eyebrow. "Reckless driving? Where's the evidence?" "We haven't processed it yet," Reed said casually, leaning against the desk. Morgan turned her attention back to Julian. "Sir, do you have any idea why you were stopped?" Julian stood, meeting her gaze calmly. "I was told it was for reckless driving, which I categorically deny. I also have a dash cam that can verify my version of events." Morgan's expression hardened as she glanced at the two officers. "You didn't review his dash cam?" Reed shrugged. "We didn't get to it yet." Morgan exhaled sharply, clearly displeased. "Get it now. And Daniels, read my office. Now." As the two officers slunk away, Julian knew the tide was beginning to turn. But this was just the beginning of their reckoning.